All right, let's go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. I know we skipped last week. Thank you for your patience. I had a few things going on that could not be moved. This week, we're going to jump into lecture 2. If you'll remember, 2 weeks ago, we spent a good bit of time talking about kind of why we do narrative reviews in the first place. And we'll review, if you'll remember, the pyramids that we had set up, which speak to kind of, there are different reviews available to you as a researcher, and where narrative reviews sit among kind of systematic reviews and scoping reviews and things like that. Also, 2 weeks ago, we talked about kind of the two critical components of narrative reviews, which are certainly that summary piece. And then next to that summary piece was something called the critical appraisal. And the critical appraisal really was the evaluative piece, saying, well, why does the summary look the way it does? It's one thing to have a summary on a particular topic, and as I will continue to narrate, especially at this point in time, it's one thing to have a summary, which technology is brilliant at this point by and large. But that other really critical piece, that critical appraisal piece, is something to keep in the back of your mind, which is, well, why does the summary look that way? How come different researchers and the different papers that I'm reading, why have they found different things based on what you know or what I know from this particular topic, from my clinical practice and things like that. I'm speaking on your behalf. I don't have a clinical practice. What can I hypothesize as to why that summary looks the way it does? Today, we won't spend as much time talking necessarily about the critical appraisal piece. What we're going to spend a lot more time today on is focusing on, well, once I have a question or an idea in mind, how do I start to begin to search for the related evidence and things like that? So we'll walk through a few different kind of tips and tricks on how to search for available evidence based on the topics that are of interest to you. But to start, as I mentioned, we're going to review some of those pyramids, which, at least for me, just help kind of paint a nice, it's easier to have an anchor visual to consider the different research types. So the first one that we're going to look at is primary research. Narrative reviews, if you'll remember, are secondary research. However, primary research involves going out and gathering data firsthand. So you can think of primary research is new data. And at the top of our primary research pyramid, we have really the most rigorous type of primary research, so randomized control trials. And then as we go down the pyramid, just like we did in our secondary research pyramid, and we will review that in a second, that recipe to conduct this type of research, that loosens up a little bit, meaning the researcher, you get to choose a little bit more how the experiment is set up. In randomized control trials, you're controlling for as many things as possible, so there are very rigorous designs. Interventional, however, you start to go down the pyramid, so you consider things like A versus B, one treatment of care, maybe a new intervention versus standard of care. And then from there, observational. So what are you observing? Sometimes it's as simple as that. What do we see among a particular cohort of patients over time? And then towards the bottom of the pyramid, we have our case studies. So case studies, if you're not already aware, typically involve very few patients, or very often involve very few patients. Sometimes there are case studies written up on single patients, which are very interesting cases that the researchers or the clinicians want to share with the broader research community for learning purposes. But as you can see at the top of the pyramid, we have really rigorous, very strict recipes when we're trying to do this research. And then as you go down, the researcher, you get a little bit more wiggle room as far as how you want to conduct your experiment, the variables that you control for, the different sizes of your treatment groups, and so on. So this is for primary research. For secondary research, so for primary research, we had new, you're going out and gathering data firsthand, and that's the data that ultimately you will be reviewing as part of your narrative review, which is considered secondary research. So for secondary research, the acronym not acronym, but kind of the keyword being review. You're looking at data that has been gathered through your primary research methods. So similar to our primary research method pyramid, at the same time, at the top of this pyramid, we have something called the Cochrane Review and the Systematic Review. A Cochrane Review, again, is just the gold standard of systematic reviews. These review types are exhaustive in nature, which means once you land on a particular topic or research question that you want to focus on, you have to find all of the available evidence and review all of the available evidence that's available to you. And so you can see why these review types, rather, they take a lot of time, they take a lot of rigorous documentation and things like that, which we need these types of reviews certainly to understand kind of the absolute state of evidence on particular topics. However, they're not always the necessary tool when you're trying to figure out something that maybe doesn't need that exhaustive piece to it. Maybe you're just looking to better understand where a gap in the literature is, or looking to compare two different schools of thought. And we'll look at, again, a few reasons why you might do a narrative review versus one of these types of reviews in a few slides. So again, the top of the pyramid being that really rigorous recipe. Scoping reviews tend to be done to see, well, where are there gaps in the literature? What don't we know? And narrative reviews equally can also do that. Narrative reviews may not necessarily be looking for gaps in the literature. Again, they may be comparing two schools of thought. They may be discussing the latest and greatest versus what we know from past for a particular treatment protocol and so on. And then finally, the historical review is as simple as it sounds. It's just really looking back in time at how something has progressed over time. So I think the example I always give is insulin use over time. Maybe we were very apprehensive to using it at first. I have no idea, I'm making this up. But over time, maybe we've started to use it more and more and more. And so by creating that narrative or that storyline, that would embody your narrative review. So we do narrative reviews even compared to the other types of reviews, simply because there's been so much research being published, especially these days. It's becoming a lot quicker to come up with papers. Whether or not they are quality or not is not what we're talking about here, but there's just a lot of research being published all the time. And so in that way, narrative reviews can be a really, really helpful way for your peers and non-experts, non-clinicians, and everyone to stay on top of really what's going on in a particular area without having to dive into individual papers to see what's happening. Everyone on this call, myself included, we're all super busy. And again, these are really helpful tools to just kind of read the review, see what's happening on that particular topic. It doesn't necessarily need to be exhaustive. Maybe you already know a decent amount about the subject. You just want to know on this particular area, what is going on? What's going on? And so the benefit, as we've been talking about, is, again, narrative reviews are non-exhaustive. Systematic and Cochrane reviews at the top of that pyramid are exhaustive. So everything comes into your review. As we'll talk about maybe at the tail end of today's lecture, if not next lecture, is the fact that narrative reviews are non-exhaustive, meaning you as the researcher, you get to decide a few different things, like what type of research do I want to include? Do I want to include, for example, only peer-reviewed research, or am I also interested in including reports from major companies like Bain or Boston Consulting Group or McKinsey and things like that? Those are the types of decisions you actually get to make when you are doing a narrative review, whereas, again, those more rigorous reviews, you tend to have to include all of the literature available, regardless of whether or not it actually might be peer-reviewed. But again, to do a high-quality, compelling review, it's not only, again, as I was saying, that summary piece, having that critical appraisal piece becomes really important, because the more you know about a topic, the more you're able to say, well, I know, or I'm speculating why the summary looks that way. I'm coming out with some hypotheses, maybe looking at the primary research and the experiments that people have done. You can say, well, the people who ran longer trials with patients who had COVID-19 found different outcomes. compared to the researchers who ran much shorter trials. And maybe that is something that in the future we should look at investigating more thoroughly. So the more you know about a particular topic, the more compelling your review will be, because that critical appraisal piece will be a lot stronger. So yeah, it will move your review beyond that simple summary to that summary and critique, or summary and evaluation, which again, at this point in time is really valuable to have that evaluation or that critique piece in place as well. Oh boy. So just this visual helps me. We won't go into detail, but again, that summary, critical appraisal, and ultimately that is what's going to create your narrative review, which is that combination of synopsis as well as insight as to why the synopsis or that summary looks the way it does. So a few things to consider when you're thinking about, well, what should I do my narrative review on? What is interesting to people? One thing you might think of is to spot a genuine gap. So doing a quick scan of other reviews or summaries in the topic or area of interest. What is interesting to you? Where is there some disagreement between different stakeholders or different practitioners? Where is there not enough evidence, and what don't we know about a particular topic? We might know a ton about hypertension in males who are between 40 and 60 years old, and we actually know nothing about hypertension in females between 30 and 40, for instance. So that is one thing to consider when you're trying to come up with a narrative review question, and to make sure that your narrative review ultimately has the impact that you hope it will, and that it's not simply another paper that someone has written. And relatedly, try to anchor your topic in relevance. I think last lecture we talked about, in the same way that there's so much research coming out lately, you want people to pay attention to your narrative review or to the paper that you're working on. And in that case, you want to make it relevant. You almost have to like sell it in a way to your audience. So by anchoring it in relevance, that's going to help, because you're going to say, well, this is a relevant topic. It might be clinical or policy. It might have something to do with patient experience, or maybe it has to do with cost effectiveness and things like that. Trying to anchor the topic that you're interested in something that's going on either in society or in your department, or that you've talked about with your peers recently. Another angle you might look at are emerging trends. Certainly there's a ton from technology, and we'll talk a little bit about AI today, or methodological advances. So thinking like new treatment methods or lines of care that are coming up, like different immunotherapy treatments and things like that. And then something else you want to consider, and we'll talk about this today and in subsequent lectures as well, is when you're thinking about what you want to focus on in your narrative review and in your research question, you want to make sure that it's neither so broad that when you go to look at the literature that's available on that particular topic, you can't really figure out, well, what to pay attention to or even what to start summarizing. And at the same time, you want to make sure that it's not so narrow that you'll find almost nothing, or alternatively, that your review doesn't really have a lot of impact to anyone else, because it might be such a narrow question that really only you're interested in, and there's not that much to write, and it's actually not really that relevant to all the other care that people are providing, for instance. So not rocket sciencey by any means, just things to consider that are somewhat intuitive. So here are a few kind of sample research questions I just wanted to have as illustrative, so that as we go through today's lecture, at least you have kind of an overarching appreciation for what some of those questions might be, if you don't already have an idea in your head. So as far as recent developments go, how have recent advances in CRISPR-based gene editing techniques transformed the landscape of targeted therapies in hereditary retinal diseases? So you can see that they've gotten pretty specific. They're not just talking about CRISPR, they're talking about CRISPR in relation to hereditary retinal diseases. You could get even more specific if you wanted to, although you would need to see how much literature is available on that. For instance, if you wanted to include a specific patient group, you might say in men or in women or in people this age and above or this age and younger. And that starts to become an iterative process between going in to look at the evidence and see what exists and deciding, well, is that too specific or not specific enough? And we'll touch on that iterative part a little bit more today as well. You might also, again, as we were just talking about, maybe want to resolve. I mean, resolve is probably not the right word, but at least discuss a debate that's going on a particular topic. So looking at the current evidence for and against early aggressive versus conservative fluid resuscitation strategies in septic shock and where clinical practice guidelines should land. So you'll notice that these questions are not, you can see that in a way, they're not really primary research-based in nature, because we're not necessarily looking at kind of quantitative outcomes. We're not looking at this versus that and what happened based on these exact outcomes. They're slightly more qualitative in nature. In looking at what is the current evidence, we'll summarize that evidence and then talk about why that summary looks that way. And then talking about clinical practice guidelines and policy suggestions and suggestions for future experiments. Those are things we'll talk about in the next lecture and the next lecture after that, when it comes to kind of what does your narrative review consist of and what outcomes or what things should you be writing in your discussion and results sections and things like that. And then lastly, just one more example here. You might want to reflect again on misalignment or different conflicting studies that have come out lately, and talk about, well, here's what they found and here's why they may have found different things. So really, conflicting results is kind of a sweet spot for narrative reviews, because you're summarizing, well, here is what exists, and then here are some hypotheses as to why we're observing these different outcomes. So for today, we're going to spend most of the lecture talking about, well, if you have a research question in mind or you have a topic in mind, what is the next thing to do from there? So that's really defining your search strategy and your review as well. So now that we have our research question in mind, if you don't have one in mind, maybe one of the ones on the previous slide kind of spurred a few different thoughts about areas you're interested in. As I mentioned at the end of last lecture 2 weeks ago, doing a review and doing research in areas that you're interested in is a lot more fun, and a lot easier. Otherwise, you're going to be forcing yourself to learn about something, and your critical appraisal is probably going to be relatively uninspired. So as much as you can, focus on topics or particular slices of topics. And what I mean by slices are maybe the topic broadly isn't your favorite, but maybe you want to focus on a particular patient group that you feel passionate about, things like that. So today we're going to talk about identifying search terms, what are search terms, selecting appropriate databases, screening and selecting sources, and then ultimately applying that inclusion and exclusion criteria. Because we've talked about the fact that narrative reviews are non-exhaustive in nature, and that's where number 4, applying inclusion and exclusion criteria, really comes into play, because you as the researcher get to say, no, I don't need to include everything. Here's what I've decided to include, and here's what I've decided to exclude. And we'll look at a few different examples of what that rather looks like, and looking at some real world ones that we've pulled from different peer-reviewed papers as well. So what are my search terms? What are search terms? Search terms are by and large keywords that you take and you use them in the different databases to find relevant research that can help you better understand or answer your research question. So you can determine your search terms in a few different ways. When you have a research question in mind, we have one on the next slide, which I'll get to, but start by removing filler words from your research question. Can be a really easy first step. Filler words are really anything other than nouns and names and things like that. And usually in a research question, you'll ultimately come out with 2 to 4, sometimes a few more, kind of core concepts of what you will ultimately end up focusing on and what you'll kind of jump into the databases to search for. So search terms I use interchangeably with keywords. And then when you're thinking about different search terms, certainly synonyms or related terms are easy things to think about. And we're going to look at a few more kind of concrete strategies on how to identify search terms in a second. But really, your aim is to capture as much of the relevant literature as possible. Search strings will help, and we'll talk about what a search string is in a second. And casting your net as wide as possible. And we'll give an example of this on the next slide. Really, when you jump into the databases, you want to make sure that you have as many keywords or search terms at your disposal as possible. Otherwise, you're going to end up searching too narrow of a lane of the database, so to speak, because you don't have all of the words identified that you should have identified to find enough of that literature. So you're going to be omitting, whether it's by accident or because you maybe were lazy and didn't want to think about all the different possible synonyms or search terms. It's going to affect what you find when you go into the databases. And then ultimately, it's going to affect the usefulness of your narrative review. So you really want to make sure that when you go searching for the relevant literature, you've identified as many different keywords or search terms as possible. Here's an example. So going back, when I said remove anything but filler words in your research question, here's a sample research question. So how have generative AI, large language models, how have they been used in higher education, teaching, and assessment? And so you can see, looking at the top row of this table, this researcher has extracted 3 different categories. The first one being generative AI and LLMs, and then the second one being higher education, and then lastly, education, teaching, and assessment, really. And so they've taken out all of these other filler words like how have, been used, blah, 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 and really, again, just focusing on the core nouns in their research question. And you can see in category 1 that they've come up with a few different synonyms, so generative AI and LLMs, which are not technically synonyms, but they're like close enough. ChatGPT, you might have other kind of brand name LLM agents or AI agents rather in there, like Perplexity or Claude or Bard. Category 2, you can see they have higher education, and then a synonym under that being tertiary education or undergraduate education. They all mean the same thing. However, different researchers are going to have used different words in their own papers. So if you only search for higher education, you may miss all the papers where researchers haven't used the words higher education. They've only used tertiary education or undergraduate education. And then lastly, in the category 3 on the far right, again, that education piece, they've just come up with a bunch of different synonyms for education here. We'll talk about why that asterisk is at the end of the word in a second. But just wanted to model out really what I mean when getting rid of those filler words and identifying what are really the core constructs of your research question that are going to help you find the relevant research in the databases. So the more search terms that you can identify, the more likely you'll be to identify all the research on the topic. So as an example, imagine your research question is focused on older adults. If you use the search terms older and aging, which is great, you're going to find some of the research because those are reasonably common keywords, but it's very possible that there's a lot of research out there that doesn't necessarily use those precise terms or those precise words. So if you use the search terms older and aging, but you also use the search terms rather senior and geriatric and as many other ones as you can think of, your search is going to find more of that related research. So it's really going to impact your impact. It's really going to impact the impact of your narrative review if you have few search terms and you're only searching a narrow slice of the database. Again, we'll look at a few different ways you can make sure that you're casting that search net as wide as possible, so to speak, including an AI prompt, which we have in here in a second. And the reason why, I mean, you do this, people use different words in different departments in different parts of the country and certainly in different countries. So you want to make sure that you're not missing out just because you're so excited to find all the related research, you didn't stop and make sure that you have a really kind of exhaustive list of search terms. So one easy one to think of are acronyms. Yes, everyone should have an acronym spelled out in their primary research paper. It does happen that researchers forget to spell out acronyms. So when you come up with your keywords for your own narrative review, you want to be thinking about, well, here's my keyword. Does it also have an acronym related to it? So thinking about mechanism of action, for example, a helpful secondary keyword is also MOA. You might come across some primary research papers that have only referred to MOA. That is poor form, honestly, but it happens all the time. Another thing to consider is wildcard. Depending on the database that you're in, wildcard in the next strategy we'll look at. They don't always work. Wildcard specifically, the following one should, but what wildcard essentially does is that it makes sure that if there are spelling differences that occur in the middle of the word, which are typically geographic variations like the UK and the US, like I have here, you're able to capture both of those variations actually without even writing out both of the words. So what you'll typically see is something like ageism in the UK and in Canada, where I'm from. Sometimes you'll have that E in ageism, and sometimes you won't. And so you want to make sure if you're searching for ageism, you don't just find papers that are related to ageism, which are geographically spelled that way, sort of thing. So by putting a question mark where that spelling differentiation usually happens, typically in most databases, you'll end up pulling out both of the outcomes. So both ageism with an E and then ageism without an E. Same thing for color, for instance. Truncation is what we saw on the table 2 seconds ago on the far right column, where they had the asterisks at the end of the word. Really what truncation is doing is slightly different from wildcard, but also very similar, which is saying, hey, this word can end in a number of different ways. I don't want to have to type out all the different ways this word might end. I'm just going to jam this asterisk on the end. And ultimately what you're telling the database is go find all of the words that have this core root word. I don't really care what comes after the asterisk. So here we have our example is technology, and you'll see we have technology, technological, technologies. You don't need to think about all of the different variations or write them out by simply putting that asterisk after the G. As we see up here, you will just be telling the database, hey, go fish for all of the root words that have this in it. Another example here just being embedded research, embedded researchers, and so on. Really, it's an efficiency play, honestly. And we're humans and we're fallible and we forget things all the time. And you might forget, oh, I forgot that that word could also end this way or that it means this thing and so on. So we'll look at a real example of some of the strategies we just looked at, in particular truncation. So this paper is about when and in what circumstances is patient-targeted Googling acceptable for health and social care professionals. So this is a narrative review, and we'll look at a few of their keywords here. So their population that they're interested in, we can tell they're interested in health and social care professionals from that research question. But they're also, as they think about the different keywords, they're like, well, what does that mean? It means doctors or doctoring and so on, nurses. They've used truncation for doctors and nurses and social workers to say, it doesn't matter if they have social workers spelt out. I'm interested in papers that might have the term social working in it, or other types of endings to those words. And then they've used synonyms like physician, therapist, counselor, and so on. And for intervention, you can see they've done something very similar. For the intervention, the patient-targeted Googling, and they've included the same phrase, and we'll talk about phrases in a second, phrases being keywords that have more than one word in them, which I know is confusing, but also not. Searching patient information because maybe they're not Googling necessarily, and so on. Comparison group, there isn't a comparison group here. Very often in secondary research, there isn't necessarily a comparison group. Comparison groups are really important when you run experiments using primary research, as we talked about in that pyramid. You need a comparison group very often to understand, well, hey, does the thing that we're testing, does it work? And in that case, you need a comparison group to help baseline what you're seeing. Otherwise, you don't know if something is working. You might say, yeah, we're seeing increasing blood pressure values in this group, and you don't know, well, are you also seeing it in the group that's not getting the new intervention? So again, in primary research, comparison groups are very important. In secondary research, they're not always as critical. And then lastly, at the very bottom, you can see for evaluation, they've just really come up with a bunch of different synonyms for evaluation, perspectives, opinions, and then also thinking through legal and ethical. So trying to identify, well, what do they care about reviewing in their narrative review, and ultimately plugging that into the evaluation piece as well. So phrase searching, going back to, I think the example here was Googling. So patient targeted Googling is actually a single keyword, but obviously there are multiple terms in it. And that's typically something called phrase searching. And when you put phrases into a database, kind of, what is it called, like search box, so to speak, it's usually very important to include double quotations. If you don't include double quotations, the database is going to assume that you actually just mean an and between each word. So going back to this slide, they might think you mean patient and targeted and Googling, which is going to pull a whole bunch of very strange search results for you. So it's really important to include those double quotations. I had an example, oh man, here that was labile hypertension. So hypertension that you can get when you stand up really quickly. If you don't include the double quotations between labile and hypertension, your database is going to think, well, she's interested in the term labile, and she's also interested in the term hypertension. And from a researcher point of view, when you have a really common word like hypertension and you don't have double quotations around the precise terms you're looking for, you can imagine that the database is going to return many, many, many more records than you actually really want. It's going to return everything on hypertension, which is a ton of research. So again, when you have those really common words in a phrase, and you maybe forget to include those double quotations, you're going to notice pretty quickly based on the volume of search results coming back to you. So again, just make sure you have those double quotations there when you are searching for terms that have keywords, terms, they're all the same thing, keywords, terms that have more than one word in them. Mechanism of action, again, is another example of that. If you don't include the double quotations around mechanism of action, the database is going to think you're saying mechanism and of and action, which is going to pull a bunch of really weird stuff on different mechanisms over here and whatever actions over there, maybe not necessarily on that precise mechanism of action term. So going back to our generative AI example, here we have our three categories again. We're going to talk about, well, now, once you have a bunch of synonyms, maybe you have some truncation like we see on the far right, making sure you're cutting off the end of the word to say, hey, database, find me anything with these core root words. It doesn't matter what comes after. We'll talk about something called search strings, which is effectively weaving the columns, going across the columns and weaving those together to create an even more kind of powerful search query. So something that you would put into the search line of the database to say, here is exactly the type of information or the type of research that I want you to retrieve for me. And the way that we link across columns and then down columns as well, as we're going to walk through right now, is through something called search operators. And search operators or Boolean operators, they help you combine, again, your keywords. That should not say search strings there. And the primary ones that we'll focus on today, and really the ones that are going to get you as probably as far as you need to, are or, and, or not. There are a whole bunch of very sophisticated ones in this resource that's linked here, which is in the slides for later. But again, I think or, and, or not are going to get you really, really far as you need to be for most things. So let's take a little bit more of a closer look at how to use these search operators or these Boolean operators to help you, now that you have your different search terms, weave those terms together to jump into the databases to tell the database, hey, here's exactly the different concepts that I'm looking for. And also, as you can see from the not, here are concepts that I really am not looking for at all, which can be really valuable. And we'll run through a use case as to why that is in a second. So I know this is a very crazy old school visual, but at the top here, if you can see the two circles crossing over, I mean, that's the Boolean operator and. None of this is terribly hard. All of you have written medical school exams before. This is very ABC. And is really, I want topics that are related to aspartame and cancer. I don't want anything that's only aspartame or only cancer. I want both of those topics together. And or is very intuitively slightly different. So if you're searching for aspartame or saccharin or sweetener, which are effectively synonyms for one another, mildly. In that case, you can see the circles. It doesn't really matter if they are overlapping or if you can only find one of these concepts in a paper, you can only find two of these concepts in a paper. I'm interested in all of it. It doesn't matter, this or that or that. And then lastly, at the bottom, not is very useful in the same example I just gave around making sure that you have those double quotations for labile hypertension, because hypertension is such a common search term and there is so much research on hypertension. Not is a very useful lever to pull when you're also using a very common search term like AIDS, for instance, AIDS meaning things that help people, and so on. So in this case, the example is you're interested in AIDS, but not hearing aids. Hearing aids is a very common search term, but if you're looking for helpers, things that maybe help people move around, for instance, mobility aids or something like that, including in your search term aids, but not hearing can help you say to the database, don't pull any of that research. It's just going to be noise to me. I don't have the time or the bandwidth to look through all of that information. So that's where that not piece can be really helpful when you have, again, really common terms like hearing aids and you don't actually want to find any of that literature, but you do want to use aid as one of your search terms. Maybe you're, again, looking at something related to mobility or social care support, things like that, where helpers and other aid synonyms might be useful. So, or very clearly can expand your search results. When you use or, you're going to say, I want this or that or both. And that way it's very intuitive. You're going to expand the number of results that you get back from the database. And also very intuitively, you're going to narrow your search results. You're saying, no, I don't want either or. I need only the instances where you can find both of these concepts together. So again, nothing gangbusters here. Going back to our example here, so we had our core concepts and then our different search terms for each one of our core concepts. What you can do with Boolean operators now is, I shrunk the table down really small, but you can weave them together using the Boolean operators, weaving your search terms together using your Boolean operators. So looking at the first column, you can see as you go down a column, so down the same keyword synonyms, so generative AI to LLM, and down you use or, because you're saying it doesn't really matter which one you find of these, find any one of these. And as you hop across columns, so from category 1 to category 2, you're saying and find one of these, and it doesn't really matter which one of these, so you use or again through those. And then, so down the columns you use or, and then across the columns you use and. So ultimately you can find a whole bunch of different combinations. You might find some papers talk about generative AI in undergraduate and then assessment, and then other ones talk about ChatGPT and tertiary and education and so on. So that's where Boolean operators can be really helpful. Otherwise you will be sitting there kind of plugging in different random keyword combinations into your database, trying to figure out or trying to gather as much evidence as possible. So searching is an iterative process. It's very rare you're going to sit down, have your research question. If you make a table like that, make your table and then jump into the database and start searching and just kind of be on your way. Typically what happens is that you'll come up with a pretty solid list of keywords and search terms. Again, those words mean the same thing. I know I shouldn't say both of them at the same time. You're going to come up with a good list of search terms, and then once you do go into the databases, it's very likely you might come across a paper and you realize, oh, they're using a term I completely forgot about, or I actually didn't realize or think to use, in which case you can go back and add that to your list of terms that you already had, which will affect your search string. So the keywords that you have knitted together with your Boolean operators. So again, be aware of spelling conventions, especially between various databases, depending on geography and things like that. So this is what it's ultimately usually ends up looking like. You're going to think of keywords, you're going to search for a few things, you're going to see what comes back at you, read through some abstracts and titles and things like that, and then refine your keywords and so on. If this was a systematic review, you'd have to do this over and over and over again until you were absolutely 9,000% sure that you had everything identified, all of the possible keywords with narrative reviews. Once you feel like you have found a good breadth of research, meaning maybe you've searched once or twice and you're like, oh, I forgot that keyword, and you're not going back in and running that search and looking at the results and every time finding like 3 or 4 different keywords that you'd forgotten about. Once you've only have found maybe 1 or 2 that are popping up that are new, and hopefully none. For narrative reviews, again, being non-exhaustive, you're probably pretty safe to just keep going on your review, which the next part would be to figure out, well, here's the evidence that I've retrieved from the databases. Now what do I do now that I'm sitting here with all of these different research records sitting in front of me? So you're probably thinking, well, AI is a super good tool to help me think through what all of these different keywords might be, and you're not wrong. Really defining your research question is important. You need to give AI context about what you're looking at, what you're looking for. So before you even open that AI command line, really have a good idea of what is your research question that you're looking for. You don't just want to think, oh, I'm interested in looking at health equity for seniors who are undergoing, I don't know, clinical treatment for dementia or something like that. You want to make sure that you have a really solid, specific question that you're going to jump in with. So using this example question, so what non-pharmacological interventions improve sleep quality in older adults with chronic pain? Again, getting rid of the extraneous words, the filler words, like we talked about in that previous LLM question. Getting rid of those filler words, so extracting the core concepts, 2 to 4, 3 to 5. Anything more than 5 means your research question might be actually too specific because you have too many different parameters you need to find. But 2 to 5 is really the sweet spot. If you have fewer than 2, if you only have 1 core concept that you're looking at, you might want to reconsider, well, what is the focus of your narrative review? Like, what are you trying to do? If you're interested in, for example, cardiovascular outcomes based on the COVID-19 pandemic, that's a really interesting review question, but you're going to get a lot of research back, and you only have 2 core concepts there. So in that case, it might be advantageous for you to introduce a 3rd concept, which might be, I'm interested in cardiovascular outcomes in COVID patients, and here's the specific patient group I'm interested in, for instance, or a specific geography, or I'm interested in this very specific cardiovascular outcome. So adding a little bit more specificity. You always want to think, well, I'm doing research, but is the outcome of this research going to be helpful, or is it too general, or is it too narrow? Again, like we talked about at the start of this lecture. So using AI to find additional search terms, you want to go, again, same exercise, extract those core concepts. So here in our research question about non-pharmacologic interventions, how do they improve sleep quality in older adults with chronic pain? Our population is older adults and our condition is chronic pain. Interventions are non-pharmacological, and then our outcome is sleep quality. If you've ever done other research, PICO, which is population, intervention, condition, outcome. I know the order I have here is PCIO, but PICO is usually a helpful acronym or backbone to think about your research question from. Well, what is the population I'm interested in? What is the intervention? What is the condition and outcome sort of thing? So here's an example of a filled out prompt. So I'm conducting a PubMed narrative review. It's important to include the specific database that you're looking at. I know we have a slide coming up on the different databases that are usually quite good ones. It'll be in this lecture deck to refer back to, but when you're jumping into AI to come up with search terms, identifying the specific database is important because all the databases have not very different, but somewhat different indexing terms that they use to index all of the research in their databases, meaning they're all pinning each one of the research papers to slightly different backbones so that when you go searching, you want to make sure you have the right words and you're using the right terms to talk to the database. it's almost like thinking about a different dialect. So everyone's talking in English, but we all are maybe talking in slightly different versions, or we might have different words for different things. So I'm conducting a PubMed narrative review on non-pharmacologic interventions to improve sleep quality in older adults. Again, really spelling out that research question. Please provide 8 to 10 synonyms or related phrases for each of. And you can see here are the PICO elements. So that population, intervention, condition, and an outcome that we identified on the previous slide. Mesh terms are something we're not really getting into in this lecture, but that is really one of PubMed's languages or dialects, so to speak. And so you're saying to ChatGPT or whatever AI that you're working with, please also provide some suggested mesh terms, so very specific to this database. I want some synonyms, but then also suggest some of these database specifics as well. And then you can also ask the AI further, please provide 3 examples, Boolean search strings. So taking those or, and, or nots, and then weaving together your search strings from there. So going back, our research question is here again. And this is what your AI output is probably going to end up looking like. So you're saying, I wanted a whole bunch of phrases and synonyms, and it's saying, well, instead of older adults, you might also consider these synonyms and phrases like geriatrics, like aged. For chronic pain, you might consider pain management. Controlled vocabulary, I know I'm introducing a few different terms here, but that is MESH, that's the PubMed special language. And they're saying, well, according to PubMed, here are a few very specific things you should use while you're searching in PubMed, because we know how they catalog all of the research, what that backbone looks like that they pin all the research papers to. Here are the specific search terms you're probably looking for in specifically PubMed, because MESH, medical subject headings, is that dialect for PubMed. And then below, you'll see the Boolean search string. So they're just simply weaving together some of those medical subject headings, the MESH headings, with your keywords using, again, the operators that we reviewed in today's lecture. So the or and nots. And so this is, in my opinion, a helpful way to come up with additional search terms and phrases, especially for databases that you haven't used a ton before, and you might not know certainly what the particular or necessary mesh headings are for PubMed when we're talking about PubMed. AI can be really useful in this case, but obviously we talked through kind of the basics before we went into AI to better understand, well, why is it using ands or ors? What are those doing? Why am I including them? Also, why is it important to have as many different search terms as possible? Again, I'm a behavioral scientist, it's a biases. If you only have a few search terms, you're only looking down a very narrow lane of that database. So AI can be a really helpful tool to help you kind of go down more lanes or broaden really your perspective of searching to make sure you actually are grabbing all of the relevant literature that can help you better discuss your research question. So her recap, I basically just did that. We talked about our synonyms and keywords and those strategies. So there are spelling differences. There are ways to obfuscate or get rid of the need to write out a million different endings or account for spelling differences. Truncation being that one with the asterisks at the end, which is really helpful. And you don't need to come up with all the different possible endings. And then phrase searching. Phrase searching, again, you're going to notice very quickly based on the volume of search results coming back to you if you forget to include double quotations where you really meant to. Our search operators, or, and, or not. Again, there are millions, that's a lie. There are hundreds, maybe, other search operators available to you. Or, and, or not, or it's going to get you pretty far. And then lastly, search strings are really what we mean when we talk about kind of knitting together those terms and those operators together. You get a little sentence, a search sentence sort of thing, if you will. And so we won't go into these databases, but they're here. Again, it depends on what you're doing your narrative review on. That's the beauty of narrative reviews. They can be somewhat clinical focused, you might be more interested in population health or primary care or health equity, in which cases these databases are going to shuffle around a little bit on which ones are going to be the most helpful. PubMed is a pretty common one, which is why we use that MESH medical subject heading example. That's a good example to use by and large for most of these topics. But we won't spend a ton of time here. Should you be searching Google Scholar? Yes, I would go to Google Scholar once you've searched the other kind of, I'm going to put it in air quotes, but like more rigorous databases, the more academic peer-reviewed databases. Google Scholar can be a really helpful tool. I typically use it as a sense check, like have I captured everything that I probably should have captured from the other databases? So I recommend jumping into Google Scholar at the tail end of your process. You need to be mindful of search quality, research quality specifically. Google Scholar indexes a lot of stuff, and certainly not all of it is peer-reviewed. And if it is peer-reviewed, it might be from a very bad journal. So you need to be a lot more careful about what you're finding here, but it can be a good sense check again. If you hop into Google Scholar, once you've done your searches on the other databases and you recognize a whole bunch of the results that are coming up and you say, yeah, I've already seen that paper and I've looked at it, you can be more confident that you're in pretty good shape as far as identifying the information that you have sought to. Google Scholar can be really helpful, lastly, in identifying gray literature. In hand searching just means clicking, not hand searching, truly. Going through the first 5 pages, just eyeballing, do you recognize what's there, as I was just saying. Gray literature just tends to refer to non-peer-reviewed literature. So as someone who is doing a narrative review, one of the options, which we'll probably talk about next week at this point, is you don't have to only include peer-reviewed literature. There might be really interesting research that's done that's not peer-reviewed. Peer reviewing a paper and getting it published is a very, very resource-intensive, time-intensive process. Sometimes researchers, myself included, have done a lot of research that doesn't end up getting peer-reviewed, in which case Google Scholar can help you identify that, and it's up to you, because you're doing a non-exhaustive narrative review, to say, well, do I want to include this or do I not want to include this? And that's what we'll start next week talking about, is that inclusion and exclusion criteria. What are the sorts of things that as you do your narrative review, you can say, well, I want to include this, but I don't want to include this. And also, certainly, here's why. You can't just say, I don't want to include this because it's too hard to get and I'm lazy, sort of thing. Obviously, you need a good answer, and you need to have a good understanding that if you are going to exclude something, it might impact how valid or how ultimately impactful your own narrative review is. All right. So I think we'll cover snowballing. Yeah, let's talk about snowballing. Snowballing, gray literature we just covered, but snowballing simply refers to, it's also called citation chaining. When you're going through a particular paper, going through the references of that paper can be actually really helpful, honestly, more helpful than I would like to admit. It's something that I have found really, really, really valuable. Just looking at the citations of papers that maybe are most relevant to your question. It's a really easy way to say, oh, I recognize that paper, I don't recognize that paper. And then you can go out and search individually for the papers that you don't recognize and that you think that you should also be covering. And then gray literature, as we talked about, it simply refers to non-peer-reviewed literature. So it might be government reports, conference proceedings, might be academics, so master's, PhD theses, where people have done a lot of really rigorous research, and maybe they just haven't put it through kind of the peer-reviewed pipeline yet or at all. All right, so I think we're about at time. We're going to cover a few different things, like what to do once you're sitting there next week in front of all of the, there's the inclusion, exclusion. Once you're sitting there and you've searched the databases, you have all of these research records in front of you. The reason why I say research records is that not everything might be a peer-reviewed paper. You might include conference posters, or you might include a report from a major company and things like that. So I say research records to better encompass all of that stuff. We'll talk about, now that you're sitting there, what do I do? How do I go through those papers? What kind of things do I need to be documenting as I read through those papers? What kinds of things should I be thinking about? So that when you start to write your narrative review, and we'll talk about the structure and the things that go in the different sections next week, you have a better idea of where to go, and you're not just sitting there overwhelmed with a bunch of information in front of you and thinking, boy, I just want to jam this into an LLM and get it to summarize it for me, which is at this point in time everyone's natural instinct. We'll figure out how to be productive now that you have a whole bunch of information sitting in front of you, and how ultimately what, again, needs to be documented for that peer-reviewed process for your submission in one straight shot. So you're not kind of going back and forth between reading and thinking and writing and so on. So next week, we'll talk about telling a story. What is the purpose of your narrative review once you have all that information in front of it? What are you trying to tell your reader? What are you going to write about, sort of thing? And we'll talk about a few guiding principles for each one of the sections as well. So it's helpful. There's my bad joke. It is helpful if you have a question in mind. I know this lecture series is particularly difficult because usually there's not very many students today, but sometimes there's kind of 50 or 70 students, and you all might have very different topics that you're interested in. But to the best of your ability, try to think of a particular topic as we go through these sections and think, well, what might my keywords be? Maybe between this lecture and next lecture, hop into ChatGPT or Perplexity or whatever tool you want to use and investigate, like, how can I come up with different keywords and so on, and try to practically apply these things. I wish we could do this a lot more in this lecture, but it's a little bit constrained from that perspective. So here's my very bad kind of disgusting joke for this week. Next week, again, I look forward to talking about what do we do now that we have evidence and different papers and things related to our research question, and then where do we go from there? How do we start writing our review and preparing it for publication? So I hope today was helpful, and I look forward to seeing everyone next week.
Have a good day.
Thank you.